Did you want to be an actor when you were a kid? Is that something like you started at? How old were you when you realized you wanted to?
Pretty early on. I knew I didn't really do that well in academia, but I understood storytelling and I wanted to be a part of that. I was a kid who grew up going lots of different places, so I was kind of constantly
Oh, right, you moved all over
reinventing
the
yourself
place,
too.
right?
So it makes sense to be an actor. You're someone new every time.
He is 55 years old, standing at a podium in Hollywood, holding a golden statue that the industry once quietly decided he would never hold. His hands are shaking, not from nerves, from something older than nerves, something that lives deeper in a man who has spent years wondering whether the version of himself that the world once loved, the laughing, invincible, golden-haired version, whether that man was ever real to begin with. Look at the photographs from 1999. The smile so wide it almost looks like a dare. The body sculpted to mythological proportion. The name on every marquee. Brendan Fraser was, for a brief and blinding window of time, the closest thing Hollywood had to a classic movie star. The kind you don't manufacture anymore. The kind that arrives once and then somehow disappears. But disappear is the wrong word. Disappear suggests accident, suggests randomness, suggests that no one made a choice. What happened to Brendan Fraser was not an accident. It was quieter than that, more deliberate, more human, the kind of thing that happens in carpeted hallways and industry cocktail parties, in rooms full of witnesses who somehow see nothing. The question no one seemed willing to ask, not while it was happening, not for years after, was this: when a man loses everything in an industry that rewards silence above all else, what does the silence actually cost him? What happens to the person left behind when the world moves on and the cameras stop? Who was Brendan Fraser? Not on the poster, not at the premiere, but alone. In the years the world forgot to look, there is a particular kind of fame that exists only in the late 1990s. It lives in a specific quality of light. The warm, oversaturated glow of summer blockbusters, of popcorn and possibility, of a cultural moment before irony became the default mode of every conversation. It was a time when movie stars were still allowed to be uncomplicated, when charm was a sufficient reason to love someone, when a man with the right jaw and the right laugh could become, for a few years, genuinely universal. Brendan Fraser was that man. He arrived in the public consciousness, not with a single lightning bolt of a moment, but with a slow accumulation of warmth. Encino Man, School Ties, George of the Jungle, and then, in 1999, The Mummy, a film that should not have worked as well as it did, a pulpy adventure built on practical effects and physical comedy, and an almost absurdly likable lead performance. And yet it worked completely. It became one of the defining films of a generation. Fraser became, seemingly overnight, one of the most bankable stars in the world. But here is what the posters never told you. Behind that open, accessible smile was a man running on something close to terror. Not imposter syndrome in the casual way people use that phrase now. Something rawer than that. Something that had been forming long before the cameras arrived. Fraser had grown up fractured, a childhood spent moving between countries, between schools, between versions of himself that the world required. He learned early, far too early, that likability was survival. That performance, in the most fundamental and human sense, was how you made people keep you. So when Hollywood arrived, he knew exactly what to do. He became what was needed: massive, warm, unthreatening, safe. What nobody knew, what Fraser himself perhaps could not yet articulate, was that this performance had a cost accumulating quietly in the background, compounding, the way costs do when you refuse to examine them, until the weight of it became something no smile could cover, no box office number could justify, no amount of applause could balance out. The story of Brendan Fraser is not a story about Hollywood's cruelty, though cruelty is certainly in it. It is not a straightforward redemption arc, though redemption is certainly present. It is something stranger and more honest than either of those narratives. It is a story about what happens to a man when the very thing that saved him, the need to perform, to please, to be loved at any cost, becomes the thing that quietly destroys him, and what it takes. Years later, in a different body, with a different face, carrying the full weight of everything that happened in between, to walk back through the door, not triumphant, not healed, just present. Just willing, finally, to be seen as he actually is. To understand Brendan Fraser, you have to understand what it means to grow up without a fixed center. He was born in Indianapolis in 1968. the youngest of 3 brothers. But Indiana was never really home. His father worked in the tourism industry, and the family moved constantly. Canada, Europe, back again. A childhood measured not in neighborhoods or longtime friends, but in airports and adjustments. New schools, new rules, new social codes to decode before you were old enough to understand that decoding was even something you were doing. There is a specific kind of child who thrives in that instability. Not despite it, because of it. A child who learns to read rooms fast, to locate the emotional temperature of a new group within minutes, to find, almost instinctively, the tone that makes people relax around them. These children become extraordinarily socially fluent. They can seem to the outside world effortlessly confident. They are rarely effortless. They are working constantly. They have simply become so skilled at it that the work is invisible. Fraser was that child. He was tall early, broad-shouldered early, handsome in the uncomplicated, all-American way that the late 20th century prized above most things. And he was funny, not in the sharp, defensive way of someone using humor as a wall, but in the generous, physical, self-deprecating way of someone who had learned that making people laugh was the fastest way to be welcomed somewhere new. Humor is hospitality, warmth is strategy, both completely genuine and both completely protective. He studied theater at the Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle, and it is here that something clarifies, because Fraser was not, at his core, a dramatic actor in the way of someone who needed to excavate darkness to feel alive. He wanted to entertain, to delight. There is nothing small in that desire. It takes enormous intelligence and discipline to make joy look effortless on screen, but it placed him in a particular category, and that category had a ceiling he could not yet see. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 90s carrying the particular hunger of someone who has never had a fixed place to belong and has decided, perhaps without fully knowing it, that fame might finally provide one, that if enough people knew his name, he might finally feel located somewhere permanent. Rooted, he was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know it for years. Encino Man in 1992 was not a serious film, and Fraser knew it, but it revealed something that serious films rarely reveal as clearly. The camera loved him in a way that is almost impossible to manufacture. There is a quality to certain performers where they seem genuinely unbothered by being watched, as if the lens is not an intrusion but simply another presence in the room, another person to charm. Fraser had that quality completely, naturally, almost unfairly. School Ties that same year showed something different entirely. A serious film about anti-Semitism in 1950s prep school culture. Fraser holding the emotional center of it with unexpected gravity. Critics noticed, the industry noticed, but the industry also noticed which film made money, and Encino Man made money, so the 90s built him in a particular direction. With Honners, Airheads, George of the Jungle, which became a genuine cultural phenomenon. Fraser in a loincloth, perfectly willing to be the joke, yet somehow perfectly in control of exactly how far the joke went. That balance, playful but not stupid, physical but never crude, was a genuine artistic accomplishment that was almost never credited as such, because the industry rarely credits that kind of intelligence when it comes wrapped in a summer movie. Then 1998, Gods and Monsters, a quiet, devastating film about the final days of director James Whale, Fraser giving a performance of real subtlety alongside Ian McKellen, something interior, restrained, emotionally true. It was the performance that should have pivoted everything, that should have opened a different kind of door. He was nominated for a Screen Actors Guild Award. Serious people took him seriously. A year later, The Mummy. The world chose. Of course the world chose The Mummy. And Fraser chose it too, consciously, hungrily, because he understood at some cellular level which kind of love felt safer. There is a difference between being admired by critics and being beloved by audiences, and Fraser had built his entire psychology around the second kind. Admiration is conditional. It requires continued proof. But the love of a mass audience, the kind generated by a franchise, by a summer blockbuster, by a film that a family watches together on a Saturday night, that love can feel, when you are inside it, like it might be permanent. It was not permanent. But in 1999, standing at the center of a global box office phenomenon, with the sequel already greenlit and his name on every shortlist and the whole bright machine of Hollywood pointing in his direction, it was very easy and very human to believe that it might be. This is where the story becomes something else. In 2003, Brendan Fraser attended the Golden Globe Awards. He was moving through the controlled, performative chaos of a Hollywood event, the handshakes and the photographers and the careful social navigation that stars learn to perform as naturally as breathing. Philip Burke was there, president of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, a man of considerable influence, which in the entertainment industry is the only currency that ultimately matters. What Burke did in that moment, what Fraser would describe years later with enormous care and evident pain as a sexual assault, is one of those things that the industry spent decades learning to absorb without consequence. A touch, a moment, something that happens in plain sight and simultaneously, somehow, in no one's sight at all. Fraser did not speak about it publicly for 15 years. 15 years. Hold that for a moment. Think about what 15 years of silence contains. Think about what a person carries, the weight of it, the particular exhaustion of it, when they have been harmed by someone powerful and have calculated correctly that speaking will cost more than staying quiet. Fraser was at the height of his career in 2003. The Mummy franchise was running. He had a family. He had married actress Afton Smith in 1998. They had 3 sons together. He had everything that the previous decade of striving had been aimed at producing. And then something was taken from him, in a hallway, at a party, something he could not name publicly without risking all of it. So he absorbed it, folded it in, kept moving, the way you do when there is no other visible option. The career did not collapse suddenly. That is the thing no one talks about clearly. It eroded, slowly, the way coastlines erode. You don't notice it day to day, but one morning you look up and something that used to be there is simply gone. The dazzled, underperformed Monkey Bone was a genuine disaster. The Mummy Returns held the franchise together one more time. Then Looney Tunes, back in action, which felt like a lateral move becoming a downward one. Then Crash, the Best Picture winner 2004, in which Fraser appeared, but in a supporting capacity, not the center. Then Journey to the Center of the Earth in 2008, a film that arrived in 3D and left cultural memory almost immediately. Hollywood is ruthless in a very specific way. It does not announce when it has decided someone is finished. It simply stops calling, or it keeps calling, but for different things, smaller things, cheaper things, projects that signal a quiet demotion on the industry's invisible hierarchy. You are still in the business, but you are no longer in the conversation. Fraser was also, during these years, going through a divorce. He and Afton Smith separated in 2008. The financial settlement was reported to be damaging. Physical injuries had accumulated from years of performing his own stunts, neck surgery, knee surgery, back surgery. The body that had been his instrument, his calling card, the thing the posters had sold to the world, that body was no longer performing the same function. It was registering instead all the years it had been asked to absorb. He gained weight. The internet, which was sharpening itself during this period into a particularly efficient machine of casual cruelty, noticed. There were jokes, there were lists, there was the specific, bloodless entertainment of watching someone who had been loved from a distance become something that people felt comfortable mocking from a distance. Not angry, just indifferent, which is almost worse. Fraser would later say, choosing his words with the care of someone who had rehearsed them many times in private, I felt that I'd been blacklisted, not paranoia, not self-pity, just an accurate description of the experience of being, for reasons you cannot fully articulate publicly, quietly removed from rooms you used to belong in. What happens to a person psychologically inside that experience is not simple to describe. Depression is part of it. Isolation is part of it, but there is also something stranger, a kind of untethering from your own identity. Fraser had built his entire sense of self on being needed, being wanted, being the warm, open, generous center of whatever room he occupied. When the room stopped opening, who was he? The child who had moved from city to city performing likability as survival. That child had never fully resolved the question of who existed beneath the performance. Now, in the silence, he had nothing left to hide behind. The silence would ask him to find out. Somewhere in the quiet years, the years when Hollywood had largely stopped looking, something began, very slowly, to shift. These transformations rarely announce themselves. They happen in small increments that only become visible in retrospect. A role accepted for reasons other than calculation. A conversation that loosens something that had been locked. A slow recognition, arriving over months rather than moments, that the armor has become heavier than whatever it was designed to protect. Fraser kept working. Theater, television, small roles in things that the industry had long since moved past discussing. He appeared in the affair on Showtime and brought something new to it, a rawness, a willingness to be uncomfortable on screen that his earlier work had never quite needed to access. He appeared in Trust, the Danny Boyle series about the Getty kidnapping, playing John Paul Getty Sr. in a performance that reviewers noted with genuine surprise was extraordinary, not movie star charming, something thornier, more interior, more honestly human. He was finding something, even if he could not yet name it. And then in 2017, when the Me Too movement began reshaping public conversation about power and harm in the entertainment industry, Fraser finally spoke. He gave an interview to GQ in which he described what had happened with Philip Burke in 2003. He was careful, he was measured, he was also visibly terrified, because speaking is an act of faith in a world that has repeatedly demonstrated that the powerful are protected and the harmed are managed, that the machinery of institutional self-protection is faster and more efficient than the machinery of justice. Burke denied the characterization of events. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association issued a statement. The gears turned, as they always turn. But something else happened too. People believed him. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough. The shift in cultural understanding that Me Too had accelerated meant that his account arrived into a world that was, for the first time in his experience, genuinely capable of receiving it without immediately routing around it, without protecting the institution at the cost of the person. He cried during the interview. He said the incident had cost him his career. He said he had felt complicit in his own marginalization by staying silent, and also that speaking had felt like a risk he could not calculate the full cost of in advance. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That is what real complexity looks like. Not contradiction, but two honest things existing in the same space at the same time. The armor was coming off, piece by piece, at enormous cost, but off. Darren Aronofsky is a filmmaker who has spent his entire career seeking performers willing to undergo genuine transformation. Not cosmetic, not technical, but something closer to demolition. Requiem for a Dream, Black Swan, The Wrestler. Films that use the actor's body and psychology as the actual raw material of the story. Films that require the performer to show up, not with a character, but with themselves. When Aronofsky began casting The Whale, the story of a reclusive, morbidly obese English teacher trying to reconnect with his estranged daughter in the final days of his life, he saw something in Fraser that the industry had spent a decade failing to see. He saw someone who knew exactly what it meant to carry weight that wasn't only physical, to be seen as less than you are, to be loved inadequately, and to have quietly accepted that inadequacy as something deserved. To want, despite every piece of evidence that wanting is dangerous, to be truly known by another person before it is too late. The role required a full prosthetic physical transformation. It required emotional exposure of the most unguarded, relentless kind. The character, Charlie, is in almost every scene, immobile, dying, and yet somehow magnificent in his refusal to lie about himself, even as he has spent his entire life lying about everything else. It required an actor who could be present in that vulnerability without flinching from it. Brendan Fraser understood all of it, from the inside out. The performance he delivered in The Whale in 2022 was unlike anything in his filmography, not because it was technically extraordinary, though it was, but because it felt inhabited in a way that only certain performances across the entire history of cinema actually achieve. When Charlie wept, when Charlie reached toward his daughter with the desperate tenderness of someone who knows they are running out of time to say the true thing. Fraser was not demonstrating emotion. He was not indicating grief for the camera. He was inside it, fully and without reservation. The reviews were extraordinary. The awards conversation began almost immediately. And then came the Academy Award for Best Actor, March 2023. Fraser at the podium, hands shaking, voice breaking in the opening seconds. The speech less a speech than a moment of a man attempting to hold himself together in public while simultaneously completely falling apart. He thanked his sons. He thanked the cast and crew. He thanked Aronofsky for seeing him. He did not frame his return as a triumph. He did not position himself as someone who had survived the industry and come back to collect what was owed. He simply stood in the light and received it, without deflecting, without performing gratitude, without reverting to the old warmth as armor that had been his survival mechanism since childhood. He just stood there shaking and let it be real. That was the whole thing. That was the entire arc, resolved in 4 minutes at a podium. The willingness to be seen without protecting yourself from the seeing. He is 55 years old, and he is holding the statue. The young man from the mummy posters, broad and invincible and smiling that extraordinary dare of a smile. He is not entirely gone. You can still find him if you watch Fraser in interviews now, in the warmth that surfaces without calculation, in the physical generosity, the way he listens to people with his whole body leaning forward. The charm was never performance, it was always genuine. It was simply never the complete picture. What surrounds it now is different. There is gravity where there is only lightness. There is sorrow he no longer feels compelled to manage. There is the particular quality that arrives in people who have survived something real and have made the quiet decision, finally, to stop pretending that surviving was anything other than what it was. He lost a decade, possibly more. He lost it to silence, to physical pain, to grief, to the way that sustained indifference from the world can convince you, if you are not careful, if you have no fixed internal center to return to, that the indifference is earned, that you deserve the quiet. Through all of it, he raised his 3 sons, showed up for them through the years when showing up for himself was its own daily struggle. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the most important thing. What exile actually does to a person is rarely what it looks like from the outside. Sometimes the years away from the machinery of it, away from the performance of being a star, away from the constant requirement of being what others need you to be. Sometimes those years create a space, painful, unwanted, costly, but space nonetheless, in which something more essential than fame can finally, slowly take root. Fraser did not return as the man who left. He returned as someone who had been somewhere and come back changed, carrying what the silence had taught him, wearing the evidence of everything he had survived in ways he no longer felt any need to conceal. There is a line in The Whale. Charlie, near the end, barely breathing, reaching toward his daughter with everything he has left, about wanting to believe that people are capable of more goodness than they give themselves credit for. It is the kind of line that works in a film because it is the kind of thing a person actually thinks when they are standing at the edge of something. When the performance has finally dropped away and only the truth remains, Fraser has earned the right to believe it. Not because Hollywood gave him back what it took, not because a golden statue could undo 15 years of silence, or a decade of erosion, or a moment in a hallway in 2003 that changed the entire trajectory of a life, but because he lived through the years when nobody was watching. And he kept going anyway, without the validation, without the marquee, without the warm certainty of being loved on a global scale. And in that keeping going, in that quiet, stubborn, unglamorous insistence on remaining present despite every reason not to, he found the one thing that the golden years, for all their warmth and noise and dazzling, borrowed light, had never quite managed to give him, himself, plainly, without performance, without apology. That is the thing that cannot be taken by any room, the thing no industry can grant and no industry can revoke, the thing you can only find on the other side of the silence if you are willing to walk through it. Brendan Fraser walked through it.